We're joined by Louis Charbonneau, Reuters UN Bureau Chief. Louis, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich. Glad to be here.
You know, if you compare what we heard from the president today compared to prior addresses, instead of as much being a collaborative, we're all in this together, reaching a hand across the aisle, there was a little bit more of a pointed directiveness to other nations, specifically in the Middle East, that they got to get their hands dirty with this too, and they can't sit by as attacks like we saw in Libya and Egypt take place. Was there a distinction with the tone from this address, maybe to prior ones?
Yes, there was. I think that this one was generally viewed as a more interesting and compelling speech than previous ones. I've heard people refer to some of his previous UN addresses as disappointing, even sort of boring. It was shorter. I forget exactly how long last year's was, but I believe it was over 40 minutes, and today he came in at half an hour. But he began and ended with Chris Stevens, the U.S. ambassador to Libya, who was recently killed in Benghazi in the attack that seemed to be, originally was considered to be a spontaneous attack because of this anti-Islam film made in the United States, but now the U.S. calling it a terrorist attack. And yes, as you said, Obama called on the entire world, said we can't accept people who are going to push hatred against the United States, against Israel, who are going to call for Holocaust denial and all of these things. At the same time, he spoke out in defense of freedom of speech while also condemning the denigration of religion. So it was something where he was really speaking directly to the 193 nation General Assembly, and it was very topical. It wasn't abstract. So it was definitely a speech that it had 6 applause points in there. There was even a laugh line. So it was quite well received, I think.
You know, you mentioned free speech, and there's a couple different references to it. To the film that sparked some of the outrage that we saw in the Middle East, but then also with a not-so-veiled reference to the speaker that we'll hear tomorrow, Mr. Ahmadinejad. Talk about how the president wove that in to say, listen, I don't support ugly, hateful speech here, but at the same time, America's based on it. People, you know, speak horribly about me every day, but we fight for their right to do so. That's a reference to what we're going to hear 24 hours from now, isn't it?
It is, and this is a fact that Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he can come to New York every year, speak at the General Assembly, he can hold press conferences in New York, and even though the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran, it honors its agreement with the United Nations and allows these people who can't stand our government and who attack the way that the United States government runs things. And so this was something that Obama was yet trying to say, look how different we are. We are expecting Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to say some of the things he said in previous years, particularly regarding Israel and his attacks on the United States and the Europeans, his defense of the Iranian nuclear program. In the past, he's also questioned the fact that, he's questioned the fact that 19 hijackers brought down the World Trade Center and suggested that he might support some of the conspiracy theories. But he's often someone who likes to bring surprises to the United Nations, so he may have something new for us. We don't know.
Well, already in pre-interviews, Louis, and I know you know this, he's talked about eliminating Israel, doubled down on that rhetoric here. He's also spoken about their insignificance. He's said they fully plan to move ahead with their nuclear ambitions and that they take preemptive attacks even on Israel if they thought an attack from Israel would be forthcoming. Could you clear up for our audience, there seems to be this conception out there that because the UN happens to be housed in New York, that the U.S. could unilaterally decide who can and can't speak there, and if they didn't want to let Ahmadinejad have an audience, let alone a platform, they could do so. Not only is that not the case, but also, can you help with some precedent? We've had a lot of unpopular, ugly speakers that have addressed the UN before, and we will going forward regardless of who's president, right?
Right. The U.S. has an agreement with the United Nations, the host country agreement, it's called. And in this agreement, they agree to let these people in, that presidents, leaders of nations, foreign ministers of countries that despise the United States. The U.S. Has honored this agreement. They don't always let everyone in. They do have the power to refuse to let these people in, but they do honor their agreement, but they're confined to a narrow strip of land within Manhattan. They can't just venture around. So there are some limitations, but the U.S. considers honoring this agreement to be an important part of its role as the host country for the United Nations, though there are often calls for simply banning Ahmadinejad, though they did deny visas to 20 of the 160 proposed members of Ahmadinejad's delegation, probably for security reasons. They wouldn't tell us why. At the State Department, they refused those 20 visas.
Hey, Louis, obviously it's an election year, and people put everything into that prism as to both what the president said and what he did or didn't do. A lot of attention being paid here that the president chose not to have any bilateral meetings at these UN, and most specifically, not having a one-on-one with Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. What is the scuttlebutt that you hear in back channels there? Were people surprised the meeting didn't take place here? Were people surprised Netanyahu went as public as he did with it, given that we're literally less than 1,000 hours away from the general election in the States? What were people saying?
Well, I think that people, once it came out that Obama and Netanyahu would not meet here at the General Assembly, it was pretty clear that this had to do with their disagreement about Iran, and maybe they feel, and I'm just speculating here, that without an ability to come out publicly with some sort of agreement in which they can smile and pat each other on the back, that it's better not to do it. They do disagree, and Obama's speech today, we haven't gotten an Israeli reaction, but Benjamin Netanyahu had called for Obama to set out clear red lines for what Iran can do and what the United States will do if it does not back down on its nuclear program, which the United States, the Europeans, and their allies, including Israel, believe is intended to produce the capability to make nuclear weapons. So it seems that their disagreement is pretty deep at this point. The United States believes there's still room for diplomacy. The Israelis appear to have reached a point where they think that the room for diplomacy is severely diminished, if not gone. So they don't exactly see eye to eye on it. At the same time, they keep saying they both have the same goal in mind, which is to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon.
Do you think, Louis, that Iran really thinks that the U.S. would take preemptive action if we got to that red line, that 11th hour? The U.S. said that they can't live with a nuclear Iran, and that the time for diplomacy is running out. But if Tehran doesn't take the threat seriously, at the end of the day, do most people think at the UN that the U.S. would actually take preemptive action, not just support Israel, but be involved as well?
I think the general view, and it's hard to say because people often just have to speculate on this, but people who are sort of observing the U.S., talking with U.S. officials who keep the answer to this question very closely guarded secret, they say that the U.S. administration is split, or that Obama certainly really does believe in having a diplomatic solution, that he may ultimately decide that some kind of military option is appropriate, but they haven't reached that point yet. They aren't sure that it could work. There is also disagreement within the Israeli security community about whether military action would actually be effective. Now, whether the Iranians believe these threats or whether they think it's just bluster to force them to take a more a softer negotiating position, it's not clear. The way the Iranians speak is they say that they're not going to back down in the face of these threats. They're not scared. They've put up with military attacks. They've put up with what they say are terrorist attacks against them, and they've put up with sanctions for more than 30 years, and they say they can continue doing it.
Louis, you should have a very interesting day tomorrow. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks.